so have I acquired a defeater for M? Well, if I only believed M due to some evolutionary cause, then my belief would definitely be irrational. In that case, my belief in M would be the definition of irrational. It would mean that I believed it without a reason. I was just caused to believe it, but I had no reason to believe it. So if I only believe in M due to some evolutionary cause, then yeah, my belief is definitely irrational. That's a point that Van Inwagen and Plantinga have both made in the arguments that we've covered. However, the mere fact that there's a causal explanation of M shouldn't worry me. Why not? Because we exist in nature, and in nature, every effect has some cause. So it's not surprising or worrying at all that my moral beliefs are caused by something, because we exist in nature, and in nature, every effect has a cause. So that's not surprising. That's something that's to be expected. Again, those are arguments that were made by Van Inwagen and Plantinga, but in the context of discussing our religious beliefs instead of our moral beliefs. What's more, many would argue that to conflate the causal explanation of my belief that M with my reason for believing M is to commit the genetic fallacy. Now, we've talked about the genetic fallacy once before. Nietzsche said that to think that his genealogical debunking arguments showed that a belief was untrue would be to commit the genetic fallacy. What does he mean by that? Well, another paper that I assigned as recommended reading is a paper by Zhang and Visala, who are represented here, and they argue that Justification GDAs, genealogical debunking arguments that claim that they undermine the justification of a belief, commit the genetic fallacy. So the idea of the genetic fallacy depends on a distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification. So the context of discovery for a belief is how one comes to believe something. That's the source or the origin of the belief. So when you're talking about the context of discovery, you're talking about the particular way that this particular person happened to come about having this belief. So you're telling an empirical, causal story about that individual's psychology. The context of justification, on the other hand, that is how one comes to prove, defend, or otherwise justify the belief. So the context of discovery is how you happen to have a belief, and you can discover beliefs lots of different ways. So sometimes you'll read about a scientist who says, "Oh, I dreamt about that idea, and then I pursued it in my research." Okay, so the dream is the context of discovery. It came about as a kind of flash of insight in the scientist's dream. But then the context of justification was when the scientist went and tried to rigorously prove that that insight that came to her in a flash of insight was, in fact, justifiable. So we don't want to confuse these two domains. Another way philosophers talk about these two domains is in terms of the space of causes and the space of reasons. So the context of discovery is the space of causes. That tells you what caused a particular individual to form a belief. And then the context of justification is the space of reasons. That's where you give other people a reason or a justification for thinking that a belief is correct. And the genetic fallacy is a fallacy where one treats items in the context of discovery as if they belong in the context of justification. And so Zhang and Visala are saying, to even suggest that the causal backstory of a belief undermines the validity or the justification of a belief is fallacious. It's to commit the genetic fallacy. You're confusing the context of discovery, which is this causal story about how a particular individual came to have a belief, and the context of justification, which is the sphere where we give each other reasons for our beliefs. And so they think that all genealogical debunking arguments are bad because they all commit this genetic fallacy. And if you look closely at Nietzsche's text, like I suggested, he seems to think the same thing. He seems to think that if you think that a genealogical debunking argument proves that a belief is false, or proves that a belief isn't justified, then you're committing the genetic fallacy. So let's look again at Bloom's Justification GDA and think about why these authors think that Bloom commits the genetic fallacy. So it's familiar, we'll just go over it really quickly. There's a causal premise. So S's belief that P is caused by some historical, cultural, economic, psychological, evolutionary, etc. process, X. So there's some kind of causal backstory about where the belief came from. Then there's the epistemic premise. That process that gave rise to this particular person's belief does not track the truth about that belief. So that's where they think that there's evidence that the belief is an error. And then the conclusion, therefore, S's belief that P isn't justified or warranted. And what Zhang and Visala are saying is that this confuses the context of discovery. So you have this causal premise about where the belief comes from, and it mixes that up with the context of justification. And that's the context where you look at what the reasons for believing something are. So this is an argument that people who try to use genealogical debunking arguments to undermine someone's justification for a belief are totally misguided. They don't understand this distinction between the context of discovery and the context of justification. So they continue further in this paper that was on your recommended reading. They say when you encounter a genealogical debunking argument, there are three possibilities. First of all, there's a situation where S, in fact, has good reasons to believe that P. So if S has good reasons to believe that P, then the justification GDA is toothless. Why? Because how S comes to believe that P is irrelevant to the question of whether S ought to believe that P. So if S has good reasons to believe that P, he's warranted, he's justified in believing it. And it doesn't matter how he happened to come across that belief or what the particular backstory for that belief is. If S has reasons to believe that P, good ones, then S is justified in believing it. Second possibility, S has no good reasons to believe that P. Well, then the justification GDA is irrelevant. If S never had good reasons for believing P in the first place, then he shouldn't believe it. And you shouldn't need a genealogical debunking argument to show S that he's being irrational by believing something that he doesn't have a reason to believe. And then the third possibility is that S's evidence for or against P are equivalent. So he has equal weight on one side and equal weight on another. In that case, they argue, the justification GDA changes nothing because it doesn't engage with the actual reasons for or against a belief. It talks about the space of causes, the context of discovery, and that's not relevant to the space of reasons and the context of justification, where you're talking about what are the reasons for or against this particular belief. So this is a very strong sort of pushback against the genealogical debunking argument. I'm not saying it's absolutely correct, but it's a very powerful response. So they say that the person who has equal evidence for their belief that P should be agnostic about P. So basically they're saying that genealogical debunking arguments have no force at all. Whether or not you should believe that P depends on your evidence and your reasons for believing that P, and the causal backstory about how you came to have that belief isn't really relevant. Okay, now I want to go back to M. Let's say that you think that cannibalism, slavery, torture, and cold-blooded murder are all wrong. What good reasons might you have to believe that? Well, you might be a Kantian, so you might argue that reason demands that I respect other human beings and treat them as ends in themselves and never as a mere means. Or you might be a utilitarian and argue that suffering is bad and happiness is good, and so I have an obligation to realize the greatest good for the greatest number of sentient beings. Obviously, this is a very simplified version of these justifications. Now, E.O. Wilson comes along and he says, nope, that's all a bunch of bullshit. The world is devoid of moral properties. And so statements that assume the existence of moral properties are systematically false. Does that sort of argument take away the warrant that you have to believe that M is true? Well, the Kantian and the utilitarian are going to respond by saying, no, Professor Wilson, you're confusing the context of discovery with the context of justification. No matter what causes our belief that M in the space of causes, what justifies our belief in M are arguments that are made in the space of reasons. And you can't circumvent the space of reasons just by telling nifty just-so stories about the evolutionary origins of morality. So, should I give up my belief in M once I see that M has some unflattering evolutionary cause? Some authors say no, not if I think that M has a valid independent justification. Otherwise, I commit the genetic fallacy. Here's another way to think about it. Rational people evaluate new evidence and consider new hypotheses in light of their evidence base. That's how a rational mind works. You take the beliefs and the evidence that you already have, and you use it to assess new evidence or consider hypotheses. If I evaluate M strictly from the sociobiological evidence base that Wilson uses to advance his theory, then indeed, it seems improbable that M is true. But if I appeal to my wider evidence base, which includes our shared moral intuitions, common sense morality, our moral and legal practices, and the more than 2,000-year-old Eastern and Western traditions in moral philosophy, then it seems perfectly probable that M is true. And that is why philosophy departments have managed to stay open in spite of knowing about evolutionary debunking arguments since at least the time of Nietzsche. So I hope you'll recognize that this is just Plantinga's argument about evidence bases, but is being applied to moral beliefs instead of religious beliefs. So let's take another break.